March 14, 1944, 11,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. The air hung thick with tropical moisture, clinging to metal and flesh alike. In the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi G4M bomber, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto felt the vibration of 3 laboring engines through his gloves. The fourth had been sputtering since they crossed New Britain. Behind him, in the fuselage they called the flying lighter, for reasons no man spoke aloud, 7 crew members hunched over their stations in darkness. No navigation lights. No communication beyond hand signals and the occasional crackle of static-filled radio. They flew by starlight and instinct, as their fathers had sailed by the same stars centuries before, trusting in courage and the favor of heaven. Yamamoto checked his watch. 2:47 hours. In 18 minutes they would begin their descent toward Empress Augusta Bay, where American supply ships clustered like sheep awaiting slaughter. Intelligence reported the harbor choked with transports, tankers fat with aviation fuel, ammunition freighters riding low in the water. A night attack, swift, invisible, decisive. The Americans would wake to fire and chaos, their precious supplies burning before dawn could reveal the attackers. This was the way of the warrior: strike from shadow, vanish into darkness. What could the enemy do against men willing to die, against pilots who flew by feel and fought by moonlight? In the ready room at Torquemada Airfield, 4 hours earlier, the squadron commander had permitted himself a rare smile. "The Americans trust their machines," he had said, tapping the intelligence report with one finger. "Their radar stations, their radio frequencies, their belief that technology can pierce the night." He paused, letting the words settle. "But technology is a crutch for those who lack spirit. We have flown through weather that would ground their best pilots. We have navigated by stars they cannot name. And tonight, we will prove once again that the warrior's heart sees farther than any machine." The men had laughed then, a sound of confidence bordering on contempt. They had heard the reports from captured airmen, the interrogation transcripts describing American dependence on electronic equipment, pilots who could not fly without their instruments, gunners who fired at radar blips rather than targets they could see. An entire military philosophy built on the foolish assumption that metal boxes with glowing tubes could replace human skill and courage. The Americans had numbers, yes, endless factories churning out aircraft like rice from a mill. But numbers meant nothing against men who embraced death as a companion, who flew with one hand and held their spirit with the other. Yamamoto had nodded along with the others, had felt the same surge of superiority. But now, alone with the darkness and the drone of struggling engines, doubt crept in like the moisture beading on his canopy. The Americans had done something unexpected in the past 6 months. Their night fighters had appeared with disturbing regularity, finding Japanese formations in conditions that should have rendered them invisible. At first, command dismissed these encounters as chance, the odds catching up, the law of averages. A few unlucky bombers stumbled upon enemy patrols in the vastness of the Pacific night, nothing more. But the pattern had hardened into something undeniable. Bombers that maintained perfect radio silence were intercepted. Formations that flew through cloud cover so thick a man could barely see his own wingtip were somehow tracked and engaged. Aircraft that took evasive action, changing altitude and heading randomly, still found American fighters closing from positions of perfect advantage, high behind, with speed and surprise. Men who survived these encounters spoke of tracer rounds appearing from absolute blackness, of explosions ripping through their aircraft before they even knew the enemy was present. Some whispered that the Americans had developed a kind of night vision, that they could see in darkness like cats. Others suggested supernatural intervention, as if the spirits themselves had changed allegiance. The official explanation involved radar, but Yamamoto and his fellow pilots struggled to grasp how the technology could work at the ranges and precision described. They understood radar as a coastal defense tool, massive antenna arrays that could detect large formations at distance, providing early warning to scramble interceptors. Shore-based radar had its uses, no one denied this. But the idea that a fighter aircraft, with its limited size and power, could carry equipment sophisticated enough to locate a single bomber in three-dimensional space, in total darkness, across distances of several miles. This seemed to violate basic principles of physics and common sense. The Americans were clever, certainly, but they were not magicians. Yet the losses continued. 3 aircraft last week, 5 the week before. Experienced crews, men who had flown since the China campaigns, who knew every trick of night combat and evasion. Gone. Simply erased from the night sky with mathematical precision. Command responded by ordering tighter formations, lower altitudes, more evasive routing. The missions grew longer, more exhausting, as pilots zigzagged across the Solomon Sea like confused moths. Still, the Americans found them. Still, the night fighters appeared from nowhere, their guns already aligned, their attacks executed with the cold efficiency of men reading numbers off a dial. Yamamoto's radio operator, Corporal Sato, tapped him on the shoulder and pointed downward. Through gaps in the clouds, the phosphorescent wake of ships caught starlight. The target. Yamamoto nudged the control column forward, beginning their descent. The formation, 9 bombers that had departed Rabaul as 11, followed in loose echelon. Standard attack profile. Descend to 5,000 feet, line up on the brightest targets, release bombs from low altitude to ensure accuracy, then full throttle for home before dawn could expose them to the swarms of American fighters that ruled the daylight sky. He was 3 minutes into the descent when his tail gunner's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with tension. Aircraft, 7 o'clock high, maybe 2,000 meters. Yamamoto's chest constricted. He scanned the darkness, saw nothing but stars and the silhouettes of his own formation. Are you certain? Movement, something crossing the stars, there, now 9 o'clock. The pilot's mind raced through possibilities. Another Japanese formation. Unlikely, they were the only mission scheduled for this sector. An American patrol, pure chance. Possible, but the positioning was wrong. Whoever was up there held the altitude advantage, the speed advantage, and seemed to be pacing them rather than intercepting. As if waiting, as if choosing the moment. All aircraft, Yamamoto transmitted, keeping his voice level. Possible contact, weapons ready, maintain formation. The acknowledgments came back, each pilot confirming. The formation tightened slightly, an instinctive response to threat. They had trained for this, had discussed the proper defensive tactics against night fighters. Stay together, concentrate fire, create overlapping fields of defensive coverage that would force any attacker to fly through a wall of bullets. The Americans were good pilots, but they were not invincible. They bled and burned like anyone else when the tracers found them. For 90 seconds, nothing happened. The target ships drew closer, their wakes now clearly visible. Yamamoto's bombardier called out ranges, preparing for the attack run. Perhaps the tail gunner had been mistaken. Perhaps it was simply another formation, passing in the night. Perhaps. The first G4M exploded without warning. One moment it flew 200 meters off Yamamoto's left wing. The next, it was a ball of orange flame tumbling toward the ocean, pieces spinning away like burning leaves. No tracer fire, no warning burst, just sudden, catastrophic destruction. Yamamoto jerked his aircraft into a hard turn, abandoning the attack run, his mind struggling to process what his eyes had witnessed. The bomber had simply ceased to exist, transformed from aircraft to fireball in the span of a single heartbeat. Brake, brake, all aircraft evade. His transmission was lost in the chaos of overlapping voices, crews shouting warnings and calling out contacts that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Another explosion, this one behind him. The formation disintegrated as pilots threw their aircraft into desperate maneuvers, diving, climbing, turning, anything to escape an enemy they could not see. Yamamoto pushed the G4M into a steep dive, the airframe groaning in protest. His crew braced against their stations, the bombardier losing his position, charts and equipment scattering. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000. He leveled out violently, pulling back on the column until the wings creaked and threatened to fold. A glance over his shoulder showed fires scattered across several miles of sky, burning aircraft falling like meteor strikes into the black ocean below. Then he saw it. Not the attacker, but its effect. A stream of tracer rounds cutting through the darkness perhaps half a kilometer away, converging on another G4M. The bullets walked up the fuselage with mechanical precision, finding the wing root, and the bomber erupted in the same abrupt manner as the others. But this time, in the brief flash of explosion, Yamamoto glimpsed something else. A silhouette. Twin engine. Larger than he expected. It flashed through his field of vision and vanished back into darkness before he could register details. But the image burned into his memory. A predator moving with absolute confidence through an environment that should have rendered it blind. His radio operator shouted, "Aircraft behind us, closing." Yamamoto didn't think. He rolled the bomber inverted and pulled, a maneuver no sane pilot would attempt in a fully loaded G4M at night. The aircraft wallowed through the turn, gravity pressing him against the straps, instruments spinning uselessly. He rolled upright, disoriented, searching for references. The ocean, the sky, stars wheeled around him. Tracer rounds passed overhead, so close he could see individual bullets streaking past. The American had anticipated his turn, but had pulled lead for where Yamamoto should have been, not where his desperate maneuver had taken him. A mistake, the first mistake, or perhaps not a mistake at all, perhaps merely insufficient data fed into whatever device guided the Americans' guns. Yamamoto's tail gunner opened fire, pouring rounds into the darkness behind them. "I see him, twin engine, large, range 300 meters. The gunner's Type 92 machine gun rattled continuously, tracers forming a cone of fire that searched for the invisible enemy. For 3 seconds the tracers seemed to connect with something, sparks, possibly impacts. Then the American broke off, diving away. "Did you hit him?" Yamamoto demanded. "Unknown, he's gone." The pilot leveled his aircraft, checking instruments. Heading northeast, away from the target, away from the attack route. Fuel state critical, they had burned reserves in the evasive maneuvers. He keyed the radio. "All aircraft, rally point Delta. Anyone who can hear me, rally point Delta." Silence. Then one by one, 4 voices responded. 4 from the 9 that had survived to reach the target area. 4 from 11 that had departed Rabaul. In less than 5 minutes of combat, the Americans had erased more than half his formation. Not damaged, not forced to retreat, erased. Removed from existence with the efficiency of a clerk crossing names off a list. The flight back to Rabaul stretched into eternity. Yamamoto kept the aircraft low, skimming above the wave tops where the ocean's surface might confuse radar, if radar was indeed what betrayed them. His crew remained silent, each man alone with thoughts of friends and comrades who would not see sunrise. The radio operator methodically destroyed code books and documents, following procedure for an aircraft that might not make landfall. The fuel gauges hovered just above empty, 3 engines now running rough, the 4th completely dead. They reached Rabaul as false dawn painted the eastern sky gray. The landing was sloppy, Yamamoto too exhausted to care about technique. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, counting holes, 37 bullet strikes, somehow none fatal to critical systems. The crew climbed out, wobbly-legged, and stood looking at the aircraft as if surprised to find themselves alive. Of 11 bombers, 3 returned. 8 crews, 56 men gone. The mathematics of attrition ground steadily toward an inevitable conclusion. In the debriefing room, intelligence officers pressed for details. What had they seen? What could they report about the American tactics, the aircraft type, the weapons employed? Yamamoto described the silhouette he had glimpsed, twin-engine, substantial, fast enough to pace a diving bomber. The officers nodded, made notes. A captain who looked too young for his rank consulted a reference manual and showed Yamamoto a photograph. Like this. The image showed an aircraft designated P-61. Black Widow, according to the American nomenclature. Twin-boom design, wide wingspan, odd appearance. Yamamoto studied the photograph and nodded slowly. Perhaps. In the dark for only a moment. They carry radar, the captain said quietly. Airborne interception radar. A system called SCR-720. The antenna is in the nose. The operator sits behind the pilot watching a display screen. The screen shows contacts as bright spots against a dark background. Range, bearing, altitude, all presented to the crew. The pilot flies toward the contact, closing until visual range, then engages. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Yamamoto wanted to dismiss them as fantasy, but the evidence of the night's massacre spoke otherwise. How is this possible? How can such equipment function with the precision needed for intercept? The captain shrugged, a gesture of helplessness. American engineering, American manufacturing capability. They solve problems by building solutions, not by cultivating spirit. He said this last part with particular bitterness, as if recognizing the inadequacy of spirit against technology. The radar pulses at very high frequency, giving fine resolution. The range is approximately 5 kilometers in ideal conditions, less in weather but sufficient for intercept. The operator guides the pilot through verbal directions until the target is visible. Then the pilot engages using the aircraft's guns, 4 20mm cannon and 4 machine guns in a belly turret. Quite lethal. Yamamoto absorbed this information in silence. Around him, other survivors sat with similar expressions, men confronting a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. The warrior code emphasized spirit, determination, willingness to sacrifice. These things they had been assured would overcome material disadvantage, but radar did not care about spirit. The SCR-720 system detected aircraft based on metal and motion, not courage or resolve. It saw equally well whether the pilot it tracked was a veteran of 1,000 hours or a frightened recruit. The electrons flowing through American vacuum tubes made no distinction between samurai and coward. They simply reported range and bearing, reducing combat to mathematics and geometry. "What are our countermeasures?" someone asked. The captain closed the reference manual. "We are developing tactics. Fly lower, below the radar's effective angle. Change altitude and heading randomly to break the tracking solution. Maintain stricter radio silence. They may be using radio direction finding as a secondary method. And we are requesting equipment from the homeland, devices that can detect radar pulses and provide warning." When will these devices arrive? Unknown. Production is limited. Priority goes to homeland defense. Which meant never. Yamamoto understood. They would continue flying into the dark Solomon night with nothing but courage and diminishing numbers, while American night fighters prowled with electronic eyes that never blinked, never tired, never failed to see. The mathematics of this equation were simple even to a pilot without advanced training. Each mission would cost aircraft and crews. The Americans would refine their tactics, improve their equipment, train more radar operators. The curve bent in only one direction. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated with grinding consistency. Missions launched, formations intercepted, aircraft failed to return. Intelligence reports described an expanding American night fighter capability. Not just P-61s now, but also radar-equipped Marine units flying F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs with smaller, lighter radar sets. The Americans were industrializing night combat the same way they had industrialized everything else, applying mass production techniques to create solutions where Japanese crews relied on individual skill. Yamamoto flew 7 more missions before the end of April. He survived 5 intercepts, watched 11 more aircraft burn and fall, learned the hard way that radar-guided night fighters attacked from below and behind, where the G4M's defensive guns had limited traverse. He learned that the Americans preferred to close to within 100 meters before opening fire, ensuring kills rather than damage. He learned that the best defense was cloud cover, thick, turbulent weather that degraded radar performance and forced the Americans to break off pursuit rather than risk collision. But the Pacific provided clear skies more often than concealing clouds, and command demanded missions regardless of conditions. The survivors developed a bitter humor. They called themselves radar targets, acknowledging their role as practice for American crews learning to use their new equipment. They made jokes about the American reliance on machines, even as they studied the intelligence briefings describing the SCR-720's capabilities. With the intensity of students preparing for examinations their lives depended on, because their lives did depend on understanding the system hunting them. The jokes were a way of maintaining dignity in the face of technological obsolescence, of pretending that Japanese spirit still mattered in a war increasingly decided by production capacity and scientific advancement. At night, lying in his quarters, Yamamoto would sometimes think back to the pre-war years, when Japanese aviation had seemed superior in every measurable way. The Zero's combination of range, maneuverability, and firepower had shocked Allied pilots at Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific. Japanese torpedoes ran deeper, faster, more reliably than American models. Japanese pilots averaged more training hours, more combat experience. For nearly 2 years, this advantage had translated into victory after victory. But those years had been an illusion. A brief moment when existing stockpiles and trained personnel created the appearance of superiority. The Americans had been learning, building, improving. Each defeat taught lessons that fed into revised training programs, new equipment designs, modified tactics. While Japanese industry struggled to replace losses, American factories achieved production numbers that seemed to violate physical law. In May 1944, Yamamoto received orders transferring him to Formosa for air defense duties. Of the 32 pilots who had been in his squadron when he arrived at Rabaul in January, 5 remained operational. 27 were dead or missing, their aircraft scattered across hundreds of miles of Pacific seafloor. The Americans had achieved this attrition while losing, by Yamamoto's estimate, perhaps 6 or 7 night fighters, a kill ratio that made mockery of Japanese claims about warrior spirit compensating for material disadvantage. His last mission from Rabaul came on May 23rd, a harassment strike against American positions at Bougainville. Intelligence promised limited fighter activity. The American night fighters were reportedly being repositioned northward as the island-hopping campaign advanced. Perhaps this would be a simple mission, like the old days when darkness provided protection and the enemy fumbled blindly through the night sky. They launched at dusk, planning to reach the target during full darkness. 6 aircraft, weaving through valleys between towering cumulus clouds. For the first hour, nothing, just the steady drone of engines and the occasional radio check. Yamamoto began to relax slightly, allowing himself to imagine that perhaps the Americans had finally overextended their night fighter coverage, that gaps existed in the network of radar and interceptors. Then his tail gunner's voice, calm now after so many encounters. Contact, 8 o'clock high, descending. Yamamoto keyed the radio. All aircraft contact reported, defensive formation. The 6 bombers drew together, creating overlapping fields of fire. They had rehearsed this maneuver countless times, trying to develop a defense against an enemy that saw them clearly while remaining invisible. The theory was sound. Concentrate enough defensive firepower in all directions, and even a radar-guided fighter would have to fly through bullets. But theory ignored the American preference for patience, for waiting until geometry and opportunity aligned before committing to attack. Minutes passed. The contact, if it existed, made no move. Yamamoto's nerves stretched taut, waiting for tracer rounds to announce the attack. His gunners reported movement in the darkness, shapes crossing stars, possible contacts that appeared and vanished. Were the Americans circling, studying the formation, calculating? Or was it imagination, fear transforming shadows into threats? Then, with clinical precision, the American attacked. Not from above, where gunners expected, but from directly below, rising through the formation like a shark breaching. The first burst caught a bomber squarely in the belly, cannon shells ripping through fuel tanks in bomb bay. It exploded so close that Yamamoto's aircraft shuddered from the concussion, fragments pinging off the fuselage. The pilot reflexively pulled up, breaking formation, watching fire rain into the ocean below. The American didn't climb past the formation or attempt a second pass. It simply vanished, dropping back into the darkness beneath them. Yamamoto's radio erupted with shouting, crews reporting contacts from multiple angles, tracers crisscrossing the night sky as gunners fired at suspected threats. A second bomber took hits, heavy machine gun fire that walked up the right wing and tore away the outboard engine. The pilot fought for control, losing altitude, gradually falling away from the formation. Maintain discipline. Yamamoto transmitted. Controlled fire only, don't waste ammunition on shadows. But discipline fractured under the psychological pressure of fighting an enemy that appeared and disappeared at will. Gunners fired at anything that moved, burning through their limited ammunition stores. The Americans, if there were multiple fighters, and Yamamoto suspected there were, pressed their advantage with professional competence, making high-speed passes, firing short bursts, never lingering in the cone of defensive fire long enough to take hits. They fought like surgeons, not warriors, each action calculated to minimize risk while maximizing effect. A third bomber went down, this time with no explosion, just the sickening sight of an aircraft falling out of control, spinning toward the ocean. Yamamoto made the decision. All aircraft abort mission, return to base, individual evasive action authorized. The formation collapsed immediately, each pilot seeking survival in maneuver and luck. Yamamoto threw his bomber into a diving turn, then reversed hard, then dove again, trying to break any tracking solution the American radar might establish. Behind him, his crew hung on grimly, the radio operator vomiting from the violent maneuvers, the bombardier clutching his station as equipment broke loose and tumbled through the fuselage. They reached Rabaul with 200 liters of fuel remaining. 3 aircraft landed, 3 from 6, 50% attrition. The mathematics continued their inexorable calculation. Yamamoto stood beside his aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, watching ground crew count holes and assess damage. 78 bullet strikes this time, including several cannon shell impacts that had somehow missed critical systems. His hands trembled slightly, adrenaline still flooding his bloodstream. How many missions? How many intercepts? How long before the law of averages caught up, before American guns found him instead of the aircraft beside him? The intelligence officer who debriefed him was new, a recent arrival who had not yet acquired the haunted look of men who recorded catastrophic losses nightly. Can you describe the attacking aircraft? I saw nothing, only tracer rounds and explosions. What about radar emissions? Did your crew detect any unusual radio frequency activity? We have no equipment to detect such emissions, Yamamoto said, hearing the bitterness in his own voice. We fly blind in every sense. The Americans see us clearly. They track our altitude, our heading, our speed. They choose when and how to engage, and we stumble through darkness hoping courage will somehow overcome physics. The intelligence officer stiffened. Lieutenant, that attitude is unworthy of what? A warrior, a samurai. Yamamoto laughed, a sound without humor. The Americans have made warrior spirit irrelevant. Their radar operators sit in comfortable cockpits, watching screens, reading numbers. They guide their pilots onto target as easily as you might guide a man through a lighted room. There is no honor in this, no test of courage. Just technology and mathematics. You survived, the officer said quietly. Others did not. Perhaps your spirit made the difference. Yamamoto wanted to explain that survival came from luck and statistics, not spirit. That each mission was a probability calculation, and he had simply been on the favorable side of random distribution more often than his comrades. That American radar could not track all aircraft simultaneously, and he had benefited from the law of large numbers. Someone had to survive purely by chance. But explaining this would require admitting that the war was already decided, that Japanese defeat was a mathematical certainty regardless of courage or sacrifice. The Americans possessed superior technology, superior industrial capacity, and superior strategic resources. Spirit could not manufacture radar systems. Determination could not conjure aircraft carriers from thin air. Willingness to die accomplished nothing against an enemy that had learned to kill efficiently from ranges where courage became irrelevant. He said none of this. Instead, he saluted, returned to his quarters, and wrote letters to the families of friends who had burned in darkness over the Solomon Sea. The letters followed formula: died gloriously, served the emperor with distinction, death was instantaneous and painless. All lies but necessary lies. The truth, that they had been hunted like animals by machines they could not see or fight, would serve no purpose except to multiply suffering. The transfer orders to Formosa came as relief. At least there, the missions would be different. Air defense against American bombers attacking from the south. Daylight operations where he could see the enemy, where the fighter combat reduced to skill and maneuver rather than electronic warfare in darkness. He packed his few possessions, said goodbye to the 5 other survivors from the original 32, and departed Rabaul on a transport flight, watching the scarred airfield recede beneath the wings. Looking back, Yamamoto could mark that period, December 1943 through May 1944, as the moment when Japanese aviators lost their illusions about technological parity. Earlier in the war, pilots had faced superior numbers but equivalent equipment. American fighters had been adequate but not dominant. American tactics had been learning doctrine, improving but still exploitable. But the introduction of airborne radar represented something different, a technological leap that created asymmetrical advantage no amount of courage could overcome. Japanese pilots continued to train in night operations, continued to emphasize visual navigation and instrument-independent flight. The Americans simply installed better radar, trained more operators, and deployed the system across their night fighter force with industrial efficiency. By war's end, American night fighters would account for thousands of Japanese aircraft destroyed in conditions that should have provided protection. The P-61 Black Widow, initially mocked by pilots like Yamamoto as ungainly and overweight, would prove devastatingly effective. The SCR-720 radar, dismissed as improbable American propaganda, would evolve through multiple iterations, each version more capable than the last. And Japanese countermeasures, the radar warning receivers that finally arrived in small numbers, the revised tactics, the attempts to jam American frequencies, would prove ineffective against an enemy that solved problems by building solutions rather than relying on warrior ethos. Yamamoto survived the war. He flew air defense missions over Formosa and eventually the home islands, facing daylight raids by B-29s escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. Different enemy, different conditions, but the same fundamental equation: American industrial capacity translating into numerical and technological superiority that no amount of Japanese spirit could balance. He surrendered on August 16, 1945, and spent 2 years in an internment camp before returning to what remained of his family. In the decades after the war, As Japan rebuilt and eventually prospered, Yamamoto would occasionally give lectures to aviation students and historians. They would ask about combat experience, about tactics and strategy. And he would tell them about the night fighters over the Solomons, about the impersonal efficiency of radar-guided intercepts, about the moment when he realized that courage had become obsolete in modern warfare. We believed that warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantage, he would say, choosing his words carefully. We were taught that Japanese pilots, with our willingness to sacrifice and our spiritual purity, could defeat enemies who relied on machines and technology. The Americans proved us wrong. They industrialized night combat. They mass-produced radar systems. They trained operators to read screens and guide pilots onto target. And we died in darkness, hunted by machines that saw us clearly while we saw nothing at all. The students would always ask the same question, but didn't this make you angry? Didn't it seem unfair? Yamamoto would consider this carefully before responding. Fair. War is not about fairness. The Americans understood something we refused to accept, that modern conflict is decided by industrial capacity and technological superiority, not by noble virtues. They outproduced us, out-invented us, and outfought us using methods we considered dishonorable. But history judges results, not methods. They won. We lost. The radar in their night fighters was simply one example of a larger truth we could not bring ourselves to acknowledge. There was one particular memory that haunted Yamamoto more than the deaths of comrades, more than the fear of those night missions, more than the bitter recognition of defeat. It came from his first intercept, the night of March 14, 1944, when 8 bombers had been erased from existence in 5 minutes. After landing at Rabaul, he had walked to the flight line and stood looking up at the stars still visible in the lightening sky. Somewhere up there, American night fighter crews were landing at their own bases, completing their mission reports, recording kills with the casual professionalism of men performing routine work. They had hunted his formation, killed his friends, and would sleep comfortably before flying again the next night. To them, it was simply a job, made possible by equipment that transformed night combat from a test of courage to a technical problem with technical solutions. And standing there, exhausted and shaking, Yamamoto had felt something he would never admit to the intelligence officers or his fellow pilots. Not anger at the Americans, not grief for the lost crews, but a deep, cold understanding that Japan had already lost the war, that the outcome had been determined, the moment American industrial capacity turned toward military production. The radar in the night fighters was merely one expression of this underlying reality. The Americans could build anything they needed: aircraft carriers, submarines, radar systems, atomic bombs. They could train crews, develop tactics, solve problems through engineering and manufacturing. And Japan, for all its warrior spirit and historical pride, could not match this capability, could not even come close. The sun that rose over Rabaul that morning had seemed like an indictment, revealing the scattered wreckage floating in the harbor, the damaged aircraft on the flight line, the empty beds in the barracks. Daylight exposed what darkness concealed: the steady erosion of Japanese air power, the mathematical certainty of defeat, the ultimate irrelevance of courage against mass production and technological advancement. In his lectures, Yamamoto never mentioned this moment of understanding. It seemed too private, too devastating. Instead, he focused on tactical details, on the capabilities of the SCR-720 radar, on the difficulty of evading electronically guided intercepts. Let the students think that his respect for American night fighters came from professional admiration. Let them believe the war was lost through strategic mistakes or resource imbalances. The deeper truth, that an entire military philosophy based on spirit and sacrifice had been rendered obsolete by men reading numbers off radar screens, was too bitter to share. But sometimes, late at night, he would remember that March morning. the stars fading, the ocean dark and littered with debris, his hands still trembling from too much adrenaline and too many violent maneuvers. And the cold, absolute certainty that the Americans had not just won a tactical engagement, but had demonstrated a way of war that made Japanese methods as outdated as samurai swords against machine guns. Technology, industrial capacity, and systematic problem-solving had defeated courage, tradition, and willingness to sacrifice. The radar in the night fighters merely made this truth visible, reducing it to tracers appearing from darkness and bombers falling in flames toward an indifferent ocean. History would record this as the Pacific War's technological dimension: radar, proximity fuses, code-breaking atomic weapons. But for the men who flew through those dark Solomon nights, hunted by enemies they could not see, it was something more personal. It was the moment when ancient certitudes shattered against modern reality, when warrior ethos confronted industrial warfare, when courage learned that it could not overcome mathematics. The Americans had not just built better equipment. They had industrialized combat itself, reducing it to processes, procedures, and production statistics. And against this approach, spirit provided no defense, courage offered no protection, and sacrifice achieved no advantage beyond delaying the inevitable. The stars that guided Yamamoto across the Solomon Sea that night still wheeled overhead, eternal and indifferent. But the men who once trusted them for navigation were gone, replaced by crews who flew by radar and instruments, who trusted electronics over instinct. A different way of war